In the summer of 695, a shopkeeper in London would take the coins you handed over, put them on a small pair of scales and weigh them in front of you. Not count them, weigh them, and then, quite often, refuse them. This was not eccentricity or bad manners. It was the only rational way left to do business, because the silver coinage of England had reached a condition that no modern economy has ever experienced and survived intact. The coins were still legal. They still carried the king's head. They simply were not worth what they said they were, and everybody knew it. A guinea that had passed at 21 shillings and sixpence was being taken at 30 in some parts of the country by the middle of that year, which is another way of saying the same thing from the other end. The guinea was gold, and the gold had not changed. What had changed was the silver you paid for it with. The figures assembled at the time are extraordinary. When clipped money was actually weighed at the exchequer, the average clipped coin held a little over half the silver it was supposed to. Half. A shilling that ought to have contained 93 grains of sterling silver contained perhaps 50, and it was passing from hand to hand as a shilling because there was nothing else to pass. The missing silver was worth more than half of everything the government raised in a year. That is the scale of it. Not a rounding error, not a nuisance for merchants, a quantity of national wealth comparable to a substantial fraction of the entire revenue of the crown, shaved off in slivers, melted down, and mostly shipped abroad. And nobody had stolen it in a single act. Several 100,000 people had stolen it a little at a time. This is the story of what the English state did about that, in the middle of a major European war, with the currency disintegrating in people's hands. It involves a treasury official with an intelligent and unpopular plan, a philosopher who argued him down on a point of principle, a chancellor who chose the expensive option, and a 53-year-old professor of mathematics who turned out to have an unexpected talent for interrogating criminals. So the first thing to understand is what English money physically was in 1695, because if you picture anything like a modern coin, none of what follows makes sense. The great bulk of the silver circulating in England was hammered coin. It was made the way coins had been made since antiquity, a blank disc of silver placed between two engraved dies, and a man with a hammer striking the top die hard once. The result was a coin whose design was often off-center, whose thickness varied, and whose edge was whatever shape the blank happened to have been. There was no milling on those edges. No grained rim, no lettering, no regular circumference. And crucially, there was no way of telling, by looking at a hammered coin, how much of its original edge was still there. A coin that had been trimmed carefully looked very much like a coin that had come irregular from the die in the first place. Some of the money in circulation was very old indeed. Silver struck under Elizabeth more than a century before was still passing from hand to hand in the 1690s, worn smooth with a design barely legible. Coins were not withdrawn and replaced on any schedule. They circulated until they physically disappeared, which is precisely what was happening. And here is the detail that makes the whole thing infuriating in hindsight. The technology to prevent it already existed and had been in use in England for more than 30 years. Machine-struck money, milled coin, cut to a uniform blank, struck under a screw press, and finished with a grained or lettered edge, had been introduced at the Tower under Charles II in 662, using French machinery and a French engineer, Pierre Blondeau, who had been trying to sell the idea to England since the Commonwealth. A milled coin is essentially clip-proof because its edge is part of its design. Remove a sliver and the grain stops. Remove a sliver from a lettered edge and a word is missing. You do not need scales or expertise or a magistrate. You need eyes. So why was half the money in England still hammered in 1695? Partly because the machinery was slow at first and the mint could only produce so much of it. Partly because the moneyers, the ancient, hereditary, fiercely protective body of workmen who actually struck the coin, had resisted a method that threatened their craft and their piecework rates. And partly because nobody had ever taken the decision to call in the old money. That last one is the real answer, and it is a lesson that recurs. The state introduced a superior product and then let the old one keep circulating alongside it, which is the one arrangement guaranteed to fail. Gresham's law did the rest. The milled coin, being worth its face value, was hoarded, melted, or shipped abroad almost as fast as it was made, and what stayed in people's pockets was the hammered rubbish. 33 years of good coinage effectively disappeared into the market, leaving the bad behind. Clipping, then, was the simplest crime in England. Take a coin, take a pair of shears, remove a thin crescent from the edge, and pass the coin on at full value. Do it to enough coins, and the clippings accumulate into a lump of silver that can be sold to a refiner or a goldsmith for its weight. The equipment cost nothing. The skill required was minimal. It was punished ferociously. Clipping and coining were treason, not felony, because they were an offense against the king's own image, and the punishment for a man was hanging, drawing, and quartering, and for a woman until 1790, burning. People were executed for it regularly. It made no difference whatsoever because the profit was immediate. The evidence was a pair of household scissors, and the risk of detection in a country with no police force was small. It also helps to see that this was not a crime of isolated individuals with scissors. It was a supply chain, and it had specialists at every stage. At the bottom were the clippers themselves, often working at home, often women, taking a slice off every coin that passed through a household. Above them were the men who bought the clippings by weight and asked no questions. Then came the refiners and the melters, who turned a bag of crescents into a clean ingot, and after them the exporters, who moved the metal to Amsterdam. And running alongside the whole trade were the coiners, proper, a different and more skilled profession, who took the silver and made counterfeit coin out of it, often by casting from molds, sometimes by striking with homemade dyes. There was a further specialism, and it is the one that shows how sophisticated the operation had become. Some men made a living purely as sorters, going through takings day after day, picking out the heavy coins to be sold for melting and passing the light ones back into circulation. That is a full-time job that produces nothing whatsoever, and the fact that it was worth doing tells you exactly how wide the gap between face value and metal value had grown. Prosecution ran into the obvious problem. Dog po! To convict a clipper, you generally needed an accomplice to inform, and an accomplice who informed was confessing to a capital offense himself. The system dealt with that by offering rewards and pardons to informers, which produced a class of professional witness whose testimony was worth precisely what you would expect. Several of the most active informers of the 1690s were themselves among the most active coiners, which is not a coincidence. Informing was how you removed a competitor. And once clipping was widespread, something worse happened, which is the mechanism that turns a nuisance into a crisis. If some coins in circulation are full weight and some are half weight and both are legally worth the same, then nobody will spend the full weight ones. You keep the good coin and you pass on the bad. That is Gresham's law, and it operates with complete reliability because it does not require anybody to be dishonest, only to be sensible. So the good money vanished from circulation. Some of it was hoarded in strong boxes. A great deal more of it was melted down and sold as bullion, because the price of silver on the open market had risen above the price the mint paid for it, which meant that turning a legal coin into an illegal lump of metal was a profitable trade in itself. And then it left the country. Silver flowed to Amsterdam, and from Amsterdam in substantial quantity to the East, because the East India Company's trade ran a permanent deficit that had to be settled in bullion. England was, in effect, exporting its own currency, coin by coin, to be melted into ingots on a quayside in Holland, which would have been serious in peacetime and was very close to fatal in war. Since 1688, England had been fighting France in what would come to be called the 9 Years' War, and the English army was in Flanders. An army in Flanders has to be paid in Flanders, which means the Treasury had to turn English taxes into coin acceptable to Dutch and Flemish suppliers. You cannot do that with clipped shillings. The remittance was made through bills of exchange, and the exchange rate the market gave sterling collapsed as the metal content of English money collapsed, because a foreign merchant asked to accept English silver made a very simple calculation about what he was actually receiving. By 1695, the cost of getting money to the army had become one of the largest single problems facing the government. At home, the effect was worse in a different way. Trade requires that two strangers be able to agree on what a payment is worth without a dispute, and by 1695 that had stopped being possible. Wages were paid in coin that shopkeepers refused. Rents were argued over. Contracts made months earlier in one kind of money were being settled in another. The country still had commerce, but every transaction had a quarrel embedded in it. Which brings us to the argument, because by 1695 everybody agreed the coinage had to be replaced, and nobody agreed on the terms. And the disagreement was not a technical one. It went to the question of what money actually is, and the two men who set it out did so with a clarity that has kept the exchange in currency textbooks ever since. William Lowndes, the Secretary to the Treasury, was the man who had to solve it, and he was not a theorist. He had come up through the Treasury as a clerk, knew the accounts intimately, and was widely regarded as the best-informed official on the public revenue in England. His proposal came from looking at the numbers, rather than from any general principle. Lowndes set his case out in a report published in 1695, with a title as plain as the man, a report containing an essay for the amendment of the silver coins. Its argument was that the market had already made the decision. Silver bullion was trading well above the mint price. The clipped coin was circulating at a value the public had settled on by experience. The law was simply behind the facts. So his solution was to move the law to where the facts already were. Raise the nominal value of the silver coin by about a quarter. Make a crown worth 6 shillings and threepence instead of 5 shillings, and recoin at that standard. The new money would be full weight for its face value, honestly made, and the country would not have to find the enormous quantity of silver that restoring the old standard would require. It is, in modern language, a devaluation, and it is what almost every government since has done in the same position. It is cheap. It is fast. It acknowledges a loss that has already occurred rather than trying to reverse it. And it can be presented as realism, because that is genuinely what it is. John Locke, then serving on the new Board of Trade, disagreed completely and did so on ground that Lowndes had not really contested. Locke's position was not economic in the modern sense at all. It was a claim about what a shilling is. Locke's answer came in a pamphlet of his own that winter, and its central sentence is the whole of the case: an ounce of silver, whether in pence, groats, or crown pieces, or in bullion, is and always eternally will be of equal value to any other ounce of silver. A shilling, on this view, is not a unit created by the state. It is a name for a specific weight of silver. The king's head certifies the weight. It does not create the value. From which it follows that raising the nominal value of the coin does not raise anything. It is a change of vocabulary. If you declare that what used to be 5 shillings is now 6 shillings and 3pence, you have not made anybody richer, you have redefined the word, and every debt contracted in the old words is now payable in less metal than it was meant to be. And that is the moral core of Locke's argument, which is what actually carried the day. Devaluation, in his framing, is the state defrauding creditors. A man who lent £100 of good silver and is repaid in £100 of a new and lighter definition has been robbed by legislation, and if the government does that once, nobody will lend to it on decent terms again. It is worth being fair to both of them, because the modern reflex is to score this for Lowndes and treat Locke as an amateur who got lucky with his reputation. On the economics, Lowndes was substantially right. The loss had happened. The market price told you so, and pretending otherwise was going to cost an enormous sum of real money. On the politics of credit, Locke was right too, and it was a government 2 years old, with a new national bank and an unprecedented volume of borrowing to place. Charles Montagu, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, had to choose between them, and he chose Locke. Montagu was 34, brilliant, ambitious, and the man who had already pushed through the founding of the Bank of England the previous year. He decided the currency would be restored to the old standard, the same weight, the same fineness, the same shilling as before, whatever it cost. The act that followed said what it was for in its own title: an act for remedying the ill state of the coin of the kingdom. Its mechanism was brutally simple. Clipped hammered money would stop being acceptable on a published timetable, first for tax payments and then for everything. After the deadline, a clipped coin was a piece of metal, which left the question that decides every currency reform, and always has. Between what the old coin says on its face and what it actually contains, there is a gap. Somebody has to absorb that gap. The whole of currency policy, then and now, is the question of who. There were 3 candidates. There were 3 candidates. The holder of the coin could take the loss by being paid out on weight, which was fair in a narrow sense and catastrophic in every other, because it would have fallen on wage earners holding a week's money and on nobody who mattered. The creditor could take it through Lowndes' devaluation, which Locke had made politically impossible, or the state could take it. Montagu chose the state. Clipped coin would be received at its face value, not its weight, within a stated window, and the Exchequer would eat the difference. It is an extraordinary decision for a government in the 4th year of an expensive war, and it is the reason the recoinage is remembered as a triumph of public honesty and also as one of the most costly administrative acts of the century. The shortfall came to about £2.7 million, which had to be found from somewhere. And what it was found from is a tax this channel has already spent a film on, the window tax, introduced in 1696 specifically to pay for the recoinage. 2 shillings on every house with more above that, and the charge fell hardest on houses with more than 20 windows. That is a connection worth pausing on, because it is the kind of thing that gets lost when history is told one subject at a time. The bricked-up windows you can still see in Georgian houses across Britain are, in origin, the bill for the silver that was shaved off the coinage in the 1690s. A tax that lasted 150 years and changed the appearance of the country was raised to pay for a currency reform that took 3 years. And then, for most of a year, Britain simply ran out of money. This is the part of the story that the textbooks tend to compress into a sentence, and it deserves more because it was a genuine national emergency. The old coin was demonetized on schedule. The new coin could not be produced anything like fast enough. Between those two facts lay 1696, in which a commercial country with a growing economy had almost no usable currency at all. Consider what that means concretely. Employers could not pay wages because there were no coins to pay them with. Markets ran on credit, tallies, tokens issued by shopkeepers, and personal trust. Landlords could not collect rents. Excise revenue faltered. There were riots in several towns, and there was real hunger among people who had done nothing except be paid in the wrong money. The timetable is worth setting out because the pain was manufactured by it. Clipped, hammered money ceased to be receivable for taxes and loans first in the early summer, which gave holders a strong reason to hand it in quickly. It then ceased to be current for ordinary payments in stages through the rest of the year. The design intent was to draw the old coin in steadily rather than all at once, and to give the mint time. In practice, the deadlines produced exactly the behavior you would predict. People rushed to unload clipped coin on the state before the window closed, and the receipts at the exchequer were overwhelmed. Queues formed. Country holders who could not easily get to a receiving point were stuck with money that was ticking towards worthlessness in a drawer. And the profiteering was immediate. Agents appeared offering to take clipped coin off people's hands at a discount, which is a rational service, and also, for anyone who had to accept it, simply the loss the government had promised to absorbed instead by them. One further consequence was permanent, and it is the reason this episode sits at the root of British banking. When metal money failed, people reached for paper. Goldsmith bankers running cash notes, bills of exchange, shop tokens, tallies and plain written promises took over the work that coin could not do, and a great many merchants who had never willingly used a banknote discovered in 1696 that they could. Habits formed under duress in that year did not go away when the silver came back. The Bank of England, then 2 years old and entirely untested, came very close to being destroyed by it. It had lent heavily to the government. It was holding clipped money, and in the spring of 1696 there was a run on it. It suspended full payment in specie. Its notes were changing hands at a discount of as much as 20%, which, for an institution whose entire product is a promise, is a serious condition indeed. It survived, partly through a call on its shareholders and partly because the government it had been lending to had every reason to keep it alive. But the episode is the origin of a pattern that recurs through British financial history, the National Bank discovering, in a crisis, that its balance sheet and the state's are the same balance sheet viewed from different sides. Its rival did not survive. A scheme called the Land Bank, promoted that same year on the theory that credit could be issued against the value of land rather than against coin and government debt, opened its subscription in the summer of 1696 and failed to raise anything like the sum required. It closed almost immediately. Had the timing been different, England's central bank might have been a very different institution. Into that, in the spring of 1696, walked a man with no experience of money at all. Isaac Newton was appointed Warden of the Mint in 1696 at the age of 53 on the recommendation of Charles Montagu, who had been his friend since Cambridge. The appointment was understood by everybody involved to be a sinecure. Newton had done his great work 20 years earlier, had suffered a serious breakdown in 1693, and was regarded as a national ornament who ought to be given a comfortable office and a salary. Thomas Neal, the master of the Mint, was an absentee, a promoter and speculator who ran the first English state lottery and treated the mastership as a source of income rather than a job. The master took a percentage of coinage and left the running of the place to others. So, the warden's post, nominally the junior of the two, was where the actual work sat if anybody chose to do it. Newton chose to do it with the same alarming thoroughness he had brought to everything else. He arrived, learned the entire operation from the metal upward, and began measuring it. He timed the presses, he counted the strikes per minute. He worked out how many men, at how many machines, working how many hours, would produce a given weight of coin in a week, and then he reorganized the building to hit the number. The Tower Mint had been a workshop, and for 3 years it had to become a factory. Horses drove the rolling mills below the walls. Presses ran from 4 in the morning until midnight. Men worked in shifts around a cramped site inside a fortress in heat and noise, and the output rose to a level nobody in England had ever attempted. 5 country mints were opened to take the overflow at Bristol, Chester, Exeter, Norwich and York, each of them supplied with dies from London and staffed with men trained for the purpose. It is one of the earliest examples in British history of the state standing up a distributed manufacturing operation at speed, and it worked. By the time it was finished, about £7 million of new silver coin was struck, milled and lettered on the edge so that clipping would be visible on sight. That last detail is the permanent fix, and it is a design solution rather than a legal one. The edge inscription on a coin is there so that a stranger can see, without weighing anything, that nothing has been removed. The other half of the job was catching the people who had caused it, and this is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because the warden of the mint was also, by ancient custom, responsible for prosecuting offences against the coin. Newton could have delegated that entirely. Instead, he took it up personally and pursued it with an intensity that unsettled people at the time. He obtained a commission as a justice of the peace. He ran informers in the taverns and in Newgate, paid out of mint funds. He went in person, in disguise by some accounts, into the districts where coiners worked. And he built case files. The mint papers are full of them, cross-referencing statements, noting inconsistencies, tracking which witness had said what and when. Newton took something like 200 examinations in person over the course of the campaign of witnesses, informers, suspects and their associates, and the surviving depositions read like the work of a man assembling a proof. He was not interested in a confession. He was interested in a structure of evidence in which each part corroborated the others, and he was extremely good at it. One thing before we go on, if you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel keep going. And there is a new piece of British financial history every single day. Had you heard of this before today, or is it new to you? Whether that is admirable is a fair question, and it has divided his biographers. There is no evidence he took pleasure in the executions, and there is a great deal of evidence that he regarded coining as an attack on the state he served. But he pursued individual men relentlessly in a system where the penalty was death, and the most famous of those men had made the mistake of attacking Newton in public. William Chaloner, a Warwickshire nailor's son turned counterfeiter, was the most capable forger in England and one of the most audacious confidence men of the age. He counterfeited French pistols and English guineas. He forged the notes of the Bank of England itself. He informed on other coiners to collect rewards, which is a lucrative position if you can manage the risk, and for several years he managed it. His real talent, though, was for institutional attack. Chaloner petitioned Parliament with proposals for making the coinage secure against counterfeiting, presented himself as an expert consultant on the very crime he was committing, and asked to be admitted to the Mint to inspect its processes. And in the course of that campaign, he accused the Mint of corruption and incompetence publicly before a parliamentary committee. That was the error. Newton, whose department had just been accused of the thing he had spent 2 years correcting, went after him with the full apparatus he had built. He accumulated witnesses. He worked on Chaloner's associates in prison. He got the case to a point where the evidence stood without depending on any single informer. Chaloner was convicted of high treason in March 1699 and hanged at Tyburn. From Newgate, he wrote to Newton directly, "In the last days," and the letter survives among the Mint papers, "Oh dear sir, do this merciful deed. Oh, my offending, you has brought this upon me." Newton did nothing. There is no record that he replied. That sentence is worth reading twice because Chaloner had understood his own case exactly. He had not merely broken the law, he had offended a particular official personally, and he grasped too late that this was the fact that would kill him. So did it work? And the honest answer is that it worked, at a price that a modern treasury would find very difficult to justify. The coinage was restored. By 1699, England had a full-weight, milled, edge-marked silver currency, and the practice of weighing coins in shops ended because there was no longer any point to it. Prices could be quoted with confidence. Contracts meant what they said. The state had absorbed a loss of £2.5 to £3 million and had, in doing so, made a very public statement that it would not solve its problems by redefining the pound. There is a comparison worth making here because it shows how unusual the choice was. A century and a half later, when the Bank Charter Act tied the note issue to gold and the rule proved unworkable in a panic, the government suspended its own law 3 times rather than let the rule destroy the banks it governed. 2.5 centuries later, when sterling could not hold its peg, Britain devalued and then devalued again. The normal behavior of a state under monetary pressure is to move the definition. Montagu did the opposite, and did it in wartime, which is when the temptation is greatest. Whether that was wisdom or an expensive piece of philosophy is still arguable. What is not arguable is that it was a decision taken deliberately, with the cheaper option fully worked out on the table in front of him and a competent official arguing for it. That statement mattered more than the coins did. The 1690s are the decade in which the English state's borrowing capacity was built. The Bank of England, the funded long-term debt, the tax revenues pledged to service it. All of that rests on lenders believing that a pound repaid will be the pound they lent. Montagu's decision was expensive precisely because it was meant to be. A cheap answer would have told the market exactly what the government's promises were worth, against which the cost was not only fiscal. The cash famine of 1696 fell on people who had no part in any of it and no capacity to absorb it, and there is no serious way to argue that a labourer in Norwich holding a week's wages in clipped shillings was well served by a debate about the metaphysics of the shilling. Lowndes' scheme would have been less honest and considerably less painful, because the silver kept leaving anyway, and this is the part of the story that almost nobody tells, and it is the part that actually decided what British money became. The recoinage restored the weight of the silver coin. It did not, and could not, change the fact that England's official ratio between gold and silver was out of line with the ratio prevailing in the rest of the world. Gold was slightly overvalued at the English mint, and silver correspondingly undervalued, which meant that the same arithmetic that had driven good hammered coin abroad in 1695 applied to the beautiful new milled coin of 1698. So it went. Full-weight English silver, freshly struck at enormous public expense, was profitable to melt and export, and it was melted and exported. Within a couple of decades, the country was short of silver again, not clipped this time, simply gone, while gold guineas circulated in ever greater quantity because they were the coin it paid to bring in. It is worth being precise about the mechanism because the silver left sounds like weather rather than arithmetic. A country that mints both gold and silver at fixed official rates is publishing a price for one metal in terms of the other. If that published price differs from the price prevailing in Amsterdam, Cadiz, or Canton, then a merchant can buy the cheap metal at home, ship it, sell it abroad, buy the other, ship it back, and pocket the difference. Not once, but on every voyage, indefinitely. The English ratio valued gold slightly high and silver slightly low, and the gap was only a few percent. But a few percent repeated on every cargo with no risk of the discrepancy closing because it was fixed by law is one of the most reliable trades ever available to anybody. Silver flowed out and gold flowed in for as long as the mispricing stood, which was most of a century. That is why the recoinage did not settle the currency question. It settled the honesty question. A coin now weighed what it claimed to and left the pricing question exactly as it had been. And a bad price does not announce itself. It shows up as an inexplicable and persistent shortage of one kind of money, complained about by merchants for decades, blamed variously on hoarders, on the East India trade, on foreigners, and on the moral failure of the age. Which is where Newton returns in a different role. He had become master of the mint after Neil's death, and in 1717 he was asked to report on the problem. His answer, after a careful comparison of the gold and silver prices prevailing in Europe, Asia, and England, was that the guinea was overvalued and should come down. So Newton fixed the guinea at 21 shillings, down from the 21 and sixpence it had settled at. It was a modest adjustment, and by his own analysis, it was not quite enough. He indicated that a further reduction would be needed to stop the outflow, and that further reduction was never made. The consequence was that silver continued quietly and steadily to leave the country, and gold continued to arrive. Britain drifted onto a gold standard over the following decades, not by legislation, not by any decision anybody announced, but because one metal kept leaving and the other kept staying. The formal adoption in 1806 merely wrote down what had already happened. There is something very characteristic in that. The Great Recoinage was a deliberate act of state, argued out in pamphlets by the best minds in the country, costed, legislated, and executed at ferocious expense. And the long-run monetary consequence for Britain came from a sixpence of mispricing in a ratio that nobody was really arguing about, which is the thought worth taking away from all of it. Currency crises are almost never resolved by the argument everyone is having. The clipping was the visible scandal, and the clipping was fixed by milled edges which made the crime detectable, and by a government willing to pay for its own coinage. But the deeper problem was a price. One metal was worth marginally more abroad than the law said it was worth at home, and that small persistent difference moved a nation's money across an ocean, one profitable shipment at a time, for 80 years. It is also a useful reminder that the people who fix these things are rarely the people the story is about afterwards. Lowndes lost the argument and stayed at the Treasury for another 25 years, running the public accounts through 2 more wars. Montagu got an earldom and a great deal of trouble, and the reorganization that actually produced the coin, the shifts, the country mints, the timings, the edge lettering, was done by a middle-aged mathematician who had been given the job as a favor. And if you want the bill for all of it, you can still see it on the front of Georgian houses across Britain. Bricked-up windows, blank where glass used to be, put in by owners doing the sensible thing about a tax that was raised in 1696 to pay for the silver that had been shaved off the coinage, which is the story we told in full in the film on the window tax, and which starts, it turns out, right here.